The church hall fell silent when Jeremy Thornton slid a thin envelope across the baptism table. Guests had gathered to welcome the newborn, his fifth daughter. The pastor still held the silver basin. Cameras were raised, witnesses everywhere. Jeremy did not raise his voice. "You've given me 5 girls," he said calmly. "I won't spend the rest of my life waiting for a son." Inside the envelope were divorce papers. Isabel Thornton didn't cry. She simply looked down at the documents, reading every line. Jeremy believed he was ending a disappointment. He did not yet know that the evidence that would destroy him had already begun to exist.
If you stay with this story, you'll see how quiet patience can sometimes reveal truths louder than anger ever could. Before we continue, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Leave your city and local time in the comments. And if stories about dignity, justice, and quiet strength speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest of this journey.
The Thornton house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Brookhaven Ridge, an affluent suburb outside Minneapolis, where the lawns were trimmed with careful precision and neighbors waved politely across driveways. The homes there were large but restrained brick facades, white columns, wide windows meant to suggest stability and success. Jeremy Thornton had chosen the neighborhood deliberately. Reputation mattered in places like Brookhaven Ridge. So did legacy. The Thornton house had 5 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a backyard wide enough for a swing set, a trampoline, and the small wooden playhouse Jeremy had once assembled on a Saturday afternoon, long ago. From the outside, the house looked exactly like the kind of place where a successful family raised children who would inherit something larger than themselves. Inside the house lived 5 daughters. Emma, the oldest, was 12 and already carried the quiet instincts of a protector. She watched her younger sisters the way some adults watched fragile glass. Sophie, 10, asked questions about everything: how airplanes stayed in the sky, why trees bent in the wind, why people whispered when they thought children could not hear. Lucy, 8, cried easily, but forgave even faster. Charlotte, 6, ran through the house with a restless energy that turned hallways into racetracks, and in the nursery at the end of the upstairs hall slept Grace, the newborn, whose arrival had changed the shape of the household, more dramatically than any of the others. Isabel Thornton moved through the house early each morning before the rest of the family woke. She had always been a quiet person, though not a weak one. People sometimes confused the two. Silence could mean surrender, or it could mean observation. Isabel preferred to listen before speaking. She noticed patterns, remembered details, and wrote things down that others forgot the moment a conversation ended. On the small desk beside the kitchen window, a leather-bound notebook sat beside her laptop. The notebook was not dramatic. It looked like something a mother might use to track grocery lists or school schedules. Inside it were dates, times, small sentences written in neat handwriting. Isabel had begun keeping notes years earlier, long before Grace was born. At first, the notes had been harmless doctor appointments, Emma's piano recital, Sophie's science fair project. Later, they became something else. Jeremy Thornton believed in structure and control, and in the idea that life should follow the plans he created for it. He was 39, tall, well-spoken, and disciplined in the way that made investors trust him quickly. His firm, Thornton Strategic Advisors, was small but profitable, specializing in helping mid-sized companies restructure their finances. Jeremy liked numbers because numbers behaved predictably. Life, in his opinion, should do the same. When Isabel had been pregnant with Emma 12 years earlier, Jeremy had been openly excited. When Sophie arrived 2 years later, he had laughed and told friends that daughters were wonderful. When Lucy was born, he had begun making small jokes about needing to even the score. By the time Charlotte arrived, the jokes had grown thinner. Margaret Thornton, Jeremy's mother, visited often during those years. Margaret carried herself with an elegant posture that made strangers assume kindness before they heard her speak. Her voice was calm, her smiles measured, and her opinions delivered with the careful softness of someone who understood social consequences. But Margaret believed certain things deeply. Family names mattered, inheritance mattered, a son mattered. She never shouted these beliefs. Instead, she spoke them gently across dinner tables and quiet afternoons. "You've built such a beautiful family," Margaret would say to Isabel while sipping tea in the living room. A pause. "And of course, one day the Thornton name will need someone to carry it forward." Jeremy rarely corrected his mother. Sometimes he nodded. Sometimes he simply remained silent, which in that household meant agreement. Isabel never argued with Margaret. Arguing would have created noise without changing anything. Instead, she watched. She noticed the way Jeremy's shoulders tightened each time someone joked about him being outnumbered by daughters. She noticed how he lingered a little longer beside friends who spoke proudly about their sons joining sports teams or learning the family business. She noticed the moment his smile thinned when Charlotte's ultrasound had revealed another girl. Those moments never became arguments. They became entries in Isabel's notebook. After Charlotte's birth, Jeremy had suggested trying again. "Just once more," he said one night while standing at the kitchen counter, his laptop still open from work. "5 is already a big family," Isabel replied quietly. Jeremy closed the laptop. "One more isn't unreasonable." Isabel did not answer immediately. Jeremy interpreted silence as hesitation, but Isabel was studying his tone, the firmness beneath it, the way the word son hovered unspoken behind the sentence. In the months that followed, the idea hardened into expectation. Margaret began mentioning it more openly. "You're both still young," she said one afternoon while Charlotte colored at the dining table. "There's still time." Jeremy repeated the same reasoning in slightly different language. A boy would balance things. Someone should carry the Thornton name. "Emma can't run the firm one day." Isabel never pointed out that Emma had never asked to run anything. Instead, she listened, and eventually she agreed to try once more. When Isabel became pregnant again, Jeremy seemed almost relieved, as though a long-standing problem had finally begun resolving itself. During the pregnancy, he spoke about the future with new enthusiasm. He looked at larger houses online. He mentioned teaching a son about business. He even began referring to the baby as him when speaking to friends. Isabel did not correct him, but she noticed other things. Jeremy started taking more late calls with his accountant. He opened a second laptop for work at home. Once, while organizing mail, Isabel saw a bank notification addressed to Jeremy from an institution she did not recognize. She did not confront him about it. She wrote down the bank's name. Later, she searched it online. Private investment accounts. Another entry appeared in the notebook. Jeremy assumed Isabel had not seen the envelope. He assumed many things about his wife. He believed she focused only on the children. He believed finances bored her. He believed she trusted him completely. In truth, Isabel trusted patterns, and patterns rarely lied. During the final months of the pregnancy, Jeremy's schedule grew busier. He traveled more frequently. He scheduled meetings with a lawyer his firm occasionally used for contract disputes. Once, Isabel overheard a fragment of a phone conversation in Jeremy's office. "Just making sure everything is prepared ahead of time," Jeremy said. The office door closed before she heard the rest. Isabel did not open the door. She wrote down the date. Weeks later, another envelope arrived from the same unfamiliar bank. Jeremy collected it before Isabel could sort the mail, but not before she had read the return address. Another note appeared in the notebook. By the time Grace Thornton was born, Isabel's notebook contained dozens of entries. Dates, financial institutions, unusual transfers, law firm names. Jeremy never noticed the notebook. He noticed many things: market trends, investment returns, the reputation of his firm. But he never noticed the quiet woman at the kitchen desk who wrote things down every morning before sunrise. Because Jeremy Thornton believed the greatest problem in his life was the absence of a son. He did not yet realize that the real problem had already been documented line by line in Isabel Thornton's careful handwriting. And the notebook was only the beginning. The labor began before dawn. Isabel woke to a dull tightening across her abdomen, a slow pressure that rolled through her body and faded again like a wave withdrawing from the shore. For a few seconds, she lay still, staring at the faint gray light seeping through the bedroom curtains. She already knew what it was. Fifth pregnancies did not announce themselves gently. Beside her, Jeremy slept on his back, one arm thrown across the pillow, breathing evenly. His phone rested on the nightstand screen, dark charging cable trailing toward the floor. Another contraction came, stronger. Isabel closed her eyes briefly and breathed through it. Then she reached for the lamp. The soft light filled the room. Jeremy stirred. "What time is it?" "Just before 5, Isabel said quietly. Jeremy pushed himself upright, rubbing his face. "Is it time?" "Yes." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he reached for his phone, checking messages automatically before his mind had fully caught up with the situation. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He stood, already moving through a familiar sequence, pulling on jeans, grabbing the hospital bag they had prepared weeks earlier, sending a short text to his assistant, canceling morning meetings. Jeremy liked order. Even childbirth could be scheduled in his mind as a logistical event. By the time the older girls woke, Isabel was already in the car. Emma stood in the front doorway in her pajamas, arms folded against the morning chill, watching the car disappear down the street. "Will the baby be a boy?" Charlotte asked sleepily from behind her. Emma didn't answer. At the hospital, the maternity ward was quiet in the early hour, before visiting families filled the corridors. Nurse Laura Bennett met them at the intake desk. Laura had worked in maternity care for 12 years. She recognized nervous fathers, exhausted mothers, joyful grandparents, anxious first-time parents who asked questions about every monitor and machine. Jeremy Thornton did not fit neatly into any of those categories. He was polite, controlled, but there was a tightness behind his politeness, a tension that seemed to revolve around a single unspoken question. Boy or girl? Laura saw it when Jeremy asked the doctor about ultrasound accuracy. She saw it when he paced near the window during Isabel's contractions. She saw it when he asked how soon they would know. Isabel, meanwhile, remained focused on breathing. Pain arrived in waves, now closer together. Laura adjusted the monitors and spoke softly to her. "You're progressing well," she said. "It may not be long." Isabel nodded. She had learned something about pain after 4 previous deliveries. It did not help to fight it. It helped to move through it. Hours passed. Jeremy stepped into the hallway frequently to take phone calls. Laura noticed. Most fathers stayed near the bed. Jeremy stood near the window instead, checking his watch between contractions. Around mid-morning, the doctor entered again, reviewing Isabel's chart. "Almost there," he said calmly. Jeremy straightened slightly. "Do you know yet?" he asked. The doctor gave a neutral smile. "We'll know in a moment." The room grew quieter. Isabel felt another contraction building stronger than the last. She gripped the side rail of the hospital bed. Laura stood beside her. "Just breathe," she said gently. The final moments moved quickly after that. The doctor focused. Laura passed instruments. And then the cry came. Sharp, clear, alive. For a second, no one spoke. Then the doctor lifted the baby slightly and glanced at Laura. "It's a girl." The word seemed to settle in the room like dust after a sudden movement. Laura watched Jeremy first. His shoulders stiffened, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. The expression crossed his face for less than a second, but Laura had seen thousands of reactions in delivery rooms. Joy, shock, relief. Jeremy Thornton showed something closer to disappointment, carefully folded into composure. The baby cried again. Laura wrapped her quickly in a warm blanket. "She's beautiful," Laura said softly. Isabel reached out her arms, trembling with exhaustion. The baby was placed against her chest. For a moment, Isabel said nothing. She simply looked down at the small face, at the tiny fingers curled into the blanket. "Grace," she whispered. The name had already been chosen, weeks earlier. Jeremy stepped closer to the bed. Laura expected the usual gestures, leaning in, touching the baby's cheek, smiling at the mother. Jeremy looked at the child briefly. Then he nodded once. "Grace," he repeated. His voice was neutral. The doctor finished documenting the delivery and stepped out of the room. Laura began checking the baby's vitals. Jeremy moved toward the window again. Outside, the sky had brightened into a pale winter blue. After a few minutes, he spoke. "Well," he said quietly. No one answered. Laura continued her work. Isabel rested her head against the pillow, Grace still against her chest. The baby's breathing slowed, settling into the rhythm of sleep. Jeremy checked his phone again. "I'm going to step out for a call," he said. Isabel looked at him briefly. "Of course." He left the room. Laura finished the last checks and adjusted the blanket around Grace. Then she glanced toward the closed door. "Would you like me to bring the baby to the nursery for a little while so you can rest?" she asked gently. Isabel shook her head. "I'd like to keep her here." Laura nodded. "Of course." For a few minutes, the room remained quiet except for the soft sounds of hospital machines and the distant movement of carts in the hallway. Laura studied Isabel with the quiet attention of someone trained to notice emotional shifts. "You handled that beautifully," she said. Isabel gave a small, tired smile. "I've done this a few times." Laura hesitated slightly before speaking again. "Your husband seems busy." The word was carefully chosen. Isabel did not respond immediately. She looked down at Grace again, adjusting the blanket slightly. "He had hoped for a boy," Isabel said. Laura nodded slowly. She had heard similar sentences before, but something about Isabel's tone felt different. Not defensive, not embarrassed, simply factual, almost as though the disappointment had been expected. Jeremy returned 15 minutes later. His expression had settled back into professional calm. "I spoke with the office," he said. "They'll handle things today." He glanced at the baby again, then at Isabel. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. Jeremy nodded. "Well, you should rest." He sat in the chair near the wall, but did not move closer to the bed. A few minutes later, his phone vibrated again. He checked the screen and stood. "I need to take this." He stepped into the hallway once more. Laura watched him go. Then she looked back at Isabel. "You have a strong little girl," she said quietly. Isabel smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "she is." But as she held Grace against her chest, Isabel's mind moved through the details she had been recording for months. Jeremy's calls, the unfamiliar bank envelopes, the conversations behind closed office doors, the lawyer's name she had once glimpsed on a document left on the kitchen counter. She did not think about them with anger, only with the steady patience of someone assembling pieces of a puzzle. Down the hallway, Jeremy spoke quietly into his phone. "Yes," he said. "It's another girl." A pause. "No," he added after a moment. "I'll move forward with the plan." Inside the room, Isabel stroked Grace's tiny hand. She had not heard the conversation, but she would soon notice the next thing Jeremy did. And when she did, she would write down the date. 3 days after Grace Thornton was born, the winter sky over Brookhaven Ridge was pale and brittle with cold. Jeremy drove Isabel and the baby home from the hospital without speaking much. The car moved through quiet streets where snow had been pushed neatly to the sides of driveways. Christmas lights still hung from several houses, even though the holiday had passed weeks earlier. Isabel sat in the passenger seat, Grace asleep in the carrier beside her. The baby's small breaths fogged the clear plastic cover slightly with each exhale. Jeremy kept both hands on the steering wheel. His eyes remained on the road. They spoke only once during the drive. "Emma is watching the girls," Jeremy said. Isabel nodded. She already knew. Emma had insisted on helping. At 12 years old, she understood more about the rhythms of the household than most children her age. When they reached the house, the front door opened before Jeremy had even parked. Charlotte ran out first, Mom. Lucy followed, then Sophie. Emma stayed in the doorway, holding the door open, her expression more restrained, but her eyes bright with relief. Jeremy lifted the carrier from the back seat and carried Grace inside. The house smelled faintly of soup and laundry detergent. Someone had tried to tidy the living room before Isabel returned home. A stack of folded blankets sat on the couch. Margaret Thornton was standing beside the dining table. She had arrived earlier that morning. Margaret stepped forward with a controlled smile. "There she is," she said softly. Isabel gave a small nod. "Hello, Margaret." Margaret leaned slightly toward the baby carrier, examining Grace with a practiced gentleness. "She's very small," Margaret said. "Healthy," Isabel replied. Margaret's smile remained. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Well, that's good." Emma carefully took the diaper bag from Jeremy and carried it upstairs. Jeremy placed the carrier on the coffee table. "Girls," he said, "give your mother some space. She needs to rest." The children nodded obediently. But Charlotte still hovered close to the carrier, peeking inside. "She looks like Lucy," Charlotte whispered. Lucy looked offended for a second. "Does not." Isabel watched them quietly. The noise of the girls filled the house in a way that felt familiar and warm. Jeremy glanced at his watch. "Isabel," he said. His tone was measured. "There's something we should discuss." Margaret stepped back slightly but did not leave the room. The girls sensed the shift in the air. Emma guided her younger sisters toward the kitchen. "Come on," she said softly. "Let Mom rest." Soon only the three adults remained in the living room. Jeremy reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He removed a thin manila envelope. The same envelope Isabel had seen earlier that morning, resting briefly on the kitchen counter before Jeremy placed it in his briefcase. He laid it carefully on the coffee table. Isabel looked at it without touching it. "What is it?" she asked. Jeremy took a slow breath. His voice remained calm, almost businesslike. "I've been thinking about our situation for a long time," he said. Margaret sat down in the armchair beside the window, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Jeremy continued. "We both know our family has grown differently than expected." Isabel said nothing. Jeremy glanced briefly at the baby carrier. 5 daughters is a lot to manage. Still, Isabel remained silent. Jeremy slid the envelope closer to her. "I've already spoken with an attorney," he said. "I believe it would be best for both of us to move forward separately." The room became very still. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street. Isabel reached forward and opened the envelope. Inside were several printed pages. She began reading. Jeremy watched her carefully. Most people expected arguments in moments like this. Tears, raised voices, shock. But Isabel read each page with the same calm attention she had used while reviewing school permission slips and grocery receipts. Her eyes moved slowly across the paragraphs. She noticed the legal firm's letterhead. She noticed the filing date. She noticed the financial disclosures listed near the end. And she noticed something else. The preparation date on the document. It was nearly 6 weeks earlier, before Grace had been born. Isabel turned the page quietly. Jeremy spoke again. "I'm not trying to be cruel," he said. I just think it's time to be realistic. Margaret nodded gently from her chair. You've both done your best, she added. But sometimes life doesn't give us the family we planned. Isabel finished reading the final page. Then she placed the documents neatly back inside the envelope. You prepared these before Grace was born, she said. Jeremy hesitated only slightly. I wanted to be ready. Ready for what? For the outcome, Jeremy said. Isabel looked at him. You mean, if the baby was another girl? Jeremy did not answer immediately. Margaret spoke instead. Jeremy has responsibilities, she said softly. The Thornton name, the future of the business, these things matter. Isabel did not argue. She looked back down at the envelope. The financial disclosure section listed Jeremy's major accounts and assets. But several details did not match the notes she had written over the past months. The unfamiliar bank, the additional account, the late-night phone calls. They were not listed. Isabel closed the envelope again. Jeremy misread her silence. I've arranged reasonable support, he said. The girls will be taken care of. Isabel looked toward the kitchen doorway where faint laughter from the children drifted into the living room. They already are, she said quietly. Jeremy shifted slightly. This doesn't have to be difficult. He continued, if we handle it calmly, the process will be faster. Isabel nodded once. I understand. Jeremy seemed relieved. Margaret relaxed slightly in her chair. Jeremy gestured toward the papers. You can review everything tonight. My attorney will file once we both sign. Isabel picked up the envelope. I will read them carefully, she said. Jeremy stood. I have to return to the office this afternoon. Margaret rose as well. I'll stay with the children, she said. Jeremy took his coat from the chair. For a moment he hesitated beside Isabel. You'll see this is the most practical solution, he said. Isabel did not respond. Jeremy left the house a minute later. The front door closed softly behind him. Margaret moved toward the kitchen. I'll make tea, she said. Isabel remained alone in the living room. Grace stirred slightly in the carrier, making a small restless sound. Isabel lifted the baby gently and held her against her shoulder. Then she returned to the coffee table and opened the envelope again. This time she read the documents more slowly. Line by line, she noted the attorney's name, the firm's address, the listed accounts, the missing ones. When she finished, she carried the papers upstairs. In the quiet of the bedroom, she opened the drawer of the small desk near the window. Inside lay the leather notebook. Isabel flipped to a fresh page. Her handwriting remained steady. January 14th. Jeremy presented divorce papers. Documents prepared December 3rd. Financial disclosure incomplete. She paused. Then she wrote one more sentence. Consult legal counsel immediately. Downstairs, Margaret's voice floated through the hallway as she spoke to the girls in the kitchen. The house sounded almost normal. But Isabel already understood something Jeremy did not. He believed the envelope on the coffee table was the beginning of the end. In reality, it was only the first piece of evidence. The house grew quiet, long after the girls went to bed. Winter evenings in Brookhaven Ridge always carried a particular stillness. The streets emptied early porch lights glowing against the snow while the distant hum of traffic faded somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Inside the Thornton house, only the soft creak of the heating vents broke the silence. Isabel sat at the small desk in the bedroom, the same desk where the leather notebook rested, beside a neatly stacked set of papers. Grace slept in a bassinet nearby, wrapped in a pale blue blanket that Emma had chosen from the hospital gift shop. Every few minutes the baby shifted slightly, making small breathing sounds that filled the room. Isabel worked quietly. The divorce papers Jeremy had given her earlier that day were spread across the desk. She had already read them once downstairs. Now she read them again. Slowly. The legal language was precise, but predictable sections about custody arrangements, asset division, child support, and timelines for filing. Jeremy's attorney had written the document carefully, presenting the separation as a practical decision between two adults. But Isabel's attention focused elsewhere. The financial disclosure page. Jeremy had listed several accounts connected to Thornton's strategic advisors and the family's primary joint account. But Isabel knew Jeremy's finances well enough to recognize the gaps. She opened the leather notebook. Several earlier entries appeared on the pages. October 12th. Envelope from Northbridge Private Bank. October 19th. Jeremy phone call after midnight. Mentioned transfer timing November 3rd. Second bank envelope. Isabel flipped back through the pages slowly. Each entry was small. Each one had seemed unimportant at the time. But patterns rarely formed from single events. They formed from repetition. She returned to the desk drawer and removed a folder she had created months earlier. Inside were photocopies of several documents she had quietly collected over time. Bank notifications that had arrived in the mail before Jeremy could retrieve them. Receipts from business trips. Printed confirmation emails Jeremy had accidentally left open on the shared home printer. Most of them were ordinary, but a few stood out. One document showed the opening of a financial account at Northbridge Private Bank. The account holder name was Jeremy Thornton. The opening date was October 8th, 2 months before Grace had been born. Isabel placed the document beside the divorce papers. Jeremy had not listed Northbridge anywhere in the disclosure. Grace shifted in the bassinet. Isabel stood and gently adjusted the blanket around the baby. Then she returned to the desk. Her expression remained calm. Not angry, not surprised, just focused. Jeremy had always believed Isabel paid little attention to financial matters. In truth, Isabel had spent years learning quietly. Marriage had taught her that financial details were often the clearest map of a person's intentions. She opened her laptop. The email inbox contained hundreds of ordinary messages. School announcements, grocery delivery confirmations, reminders from Emma's piano teacher. But Isabel had learned long ago that Jeremy sometimes used the home printer when working late at night, and when documents printed copies of the notifications occasionally appeared in the shared family email account. She searched for the word Northbridge. 2 results appeared. Both were automatic notifications. One was from October. The second was from late November. Isabel opened the November message. Transfer confirmation. Northbridge Private Bank. The amount listed was significant, more than Isabel expected. The sender address was connected to Jeremy's business account. She printed the email. The printer hummed quietly in the corner of the room. Isabel placed the page beside the other documents. Another entry appeared in the notebook. November 28th. Large transfer to Northbridge account. For a moment she sat still thinking. Jeremy's divorce papers had been prepared on December 3rd. The transfer had happened only days earlier, which meant something important. Jeremy had begun rearranging his finances before the divorce conversation ever happened. Isabel closed the notebook briefly. She leaned back in the chair and listened to the quiet house. Down the hallway, one of the girls shifted in her sleep. The heating system clicked on again. 5 daughters. Jeremy had spoken about them earlier that afternoon as though they were a burden. But to Isabel, the girls were the only reason the silence in the house felt meaningful instead of empty. Emma would wake early for school tomorrow. Sophie would ask questions about the new baby. Lucy would probably cry if someone teased Charlotte again. Isabel had spent 12 years learning how to hold their world steady. She would not allow Jeremy's decisions to shatter it now. Grace made another small sound in the bassinet. Isabel stood and gently lifted her. The baby settled quickly against her shoulder. For several minutes, Isabel walked slowly across the bedroom, rocking the child until the breathing steadied again. Then she returned Grace to the bassinet and resumed working. The next document she examined was the letterhead on Jeremy's divorce papers. Fletcher and Dunn family law. Isabel had seen that name before. She opened the notebook again. A page from 2 weeks earlier caught her attention. December 1st, Jeremy call in office. Heard Fletcher. She had written the word after passing Jeremy's office door while he spoke on the phone. At the time, it had seemed minor. Now it matched the attorney's firm. Jeremy believed he had arranged everything carefully, but planning leaves traces. Isabel opened a new page in the notebook. At the top, she wrote. Evidence below it, she listed several items. Northbridge account opening. November transfer. Divorce documents prepared before birth. Attorney contact, Fletcher and Dunn. The list remained short, but lists grow. Isabel knew that. She closed the notebook and stacked the documents neatly. The next step required something Jeremy would not expect. Legal advice, not from the attorney Jeremy had chosen, from someone who worked for her. The next morning arrived quietly. Snow covered the driveway in a thin layer of powder. Emma helped the younger girls prepare for school, while Isabel sat at the kitchen table, with Grace sleeping against her chest. Margaret Thornton had left early to attend a charity committee meeting across town. Jeremy had already gone to the office. The house was peaceful. After the girls left for school, Isabel opened her laptop again. She searched for family law attorneys Minneapolis. Several names appeared, some advertised aggressively. Others specialized in high-conflict divorces. Isabel ignored those. Finally, she found a firm, known for complex financial cases. One attorney stood out. Daniel Brooks, family law specialist. His biography mentioned asset tracing and financial disclosure disputes, exactly the kind of detail Jeremy's documents had tried to simplify. Isabel read the profile carefully. Then she picked up her phone. Grace stirred slightly as Isabel dialed the number. A receptionist answered. Brooks and Halstead Law Offices. Hello, Isabel said calmly. My name is Isabel Thornton. I'd like to schedule a consultation. There was a brief pause as the receptionist checked the calendar. Mr. Brooks has an opening Thursday morning. That will work. The appointment was confirmed within minutes. Isabel ended the call. She did not feel triumph, only clarity. Upstairs, the leather notebook waited on the desk. Inside it were dates Jeremy had never noticed, numbers he believed Isabel did not understand, and the beginning of a record that would soon grow far larger than Jeremy imagined. Because Isabel Thornton had spent years listening quietly, now she would begin asking the right questions. Thursday morning arrived with a steady snowfall that softened the edges of the city. Brookhaven Ridge looked almost untouched beneath the white blanket. Tree branches sagged under the weight, and the quiet streets reflected the pale winter light like sheets of glass. Isabel dressed simply. A dark wool coat, flat boots, her hair pulled back neatly. Grace slept in a carrier against her chest while Isabel checked the kitchen clock. 9:10 a.m. Emma had already walked her sisters to the school bus stop. The house was quiet again. Jeremy believed Isabel spent most mornings at home, caring for the baby. Today she would leave the neighborhood for the first time since returning from the hospital. The drive downtown took nearly 30 minutes. Minneapolis rose gradually from the snowy streets, steel buildings, glass towers, and busy intersections where commuters hurried through the cold. Isabel parked in a visitor lot near the law office building. She stepped carefully through the snow, Grace sleeping peacefully against her. Inside the lobby was warm and quiet. A polished brass directory listed several law firms on the upper floors. Brooks and Halstead, Suite 904. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical hum. When Isabel stepped into the 9th floor reception area, a woman behind the desk looked up. "Good morning. Good morning," Isabel replied calmly. "I have a 10 o'clock consultation with Daniel Brooks." The receptionist smiled politely. "Of course. Please have a seat." The waiting area was quiet and orderly. Framed certificates hung along the walls beside photographs of city landmarks. Isabel sat near the window, rocking Grace gently, while she reviewed the folder in her lap. Inside were copies of the documents she had gathered: the divorce papers, the Northbridge account confirmation, the transfer notice, several printed emails. Her notebook rested beneath them. A door opened across the reception area. A tall man in his mid-40s stepped out, adjusting his glasses slightly as he glanced toward the waiting chairs. Mrs. Thornton Isabel stood. "Yes." Daniel Brooks approached with a calm, professional expression. He had the measured demeanor of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "I'm Daniel Brooks. Thank you for coming in." His eyes briefly noticed the baby carrier. "And congratulations." "Thank you." He gestured toward the hallway. "Please come in." His office was modest but organized: dark wood shelves filled with legal books, a large desk near the window, and 2 chairs positioned across from him. Daniel waited while Isabel settled into one of the chairs and adjusted Grace's blanket. "Would you like coffee or water?" he asked. "No, thank you." Daniel sat down and folded his hands on the desk. So he said gently, "How can I help you today?" Isabel placed the folder in front of him. "My husband gave me divorce papers 3 days ago." Daniel nodded. "Was the separation discussed beforehand?" "Number any prior counseling or mediation?" Daniel opened the folder. The first document he saw was the divorce filing prepared by Fletcher and Dunn. He read the first page quickly. Then he continued reading. The room remained quiet except for the faint rustle of paper. Isabel watched him without speaking. Daniel turned the page slowly. When he reached the financial disclosure section, his expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough for Isabel to notice. "Did your husband prepare this himself?" he asked. "No, his attorney did." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Do you believe these financial disclosures are accurate?" Isabel slid another document across the desk, the Northbridge bank confirmation. Daniel examined it carefully. "This account isn't listed in the disclosure," he said. "No." He flipped to the next page. "The transfer confirmation." Daniel's eyes paused on the date. "November 28th, he said quietly. Isabel nodded. "My husband's divorce documents were prepared December 3rd. Daniel tapped the paper lightly with his pen. "So the transfer happened before the divorce filing?" "Yes." "And this account was opened in October?" "Yes." Daniel studied Isabel for a moment. "You've been keeping records." Isabel placed the leather notebook on the desk. "I write things down." Daniel opened the notebook. The entries were precise. Dates, short observations, bank names, phone calls, fragments of overheard conversations. Daniel flipped through several pages silently. Finally, he closed the notebook. "You've already done a large portion of the work most clients struggle with," he said. Isabel waited. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm going to ask you a very direct question." "Of course. Do you believe your husband moved money in order to hide it before the divorce?" "Yes." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's called asset concealment." He tapped the divorce document again. "In Minnesota, both spouses are legally required to disclose all marital assets during a divorce." Isabel listened carefully. "If assets were intentionally hidden," Daniel continued, "the court can impose serious consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Daniel spoke calmly. "Financial penalties, reallocation of assets, in some cases, credibility damage that affects custody decisions." Isabel absorbed the information without visible reaction. Daniel continued reviewing the documents. "These transfers appear to come from your husband's business account," he said. "Yes. Is Thornton Strategic Advisors jointly owned numbered? Jeremy started it before we married." Daniel nodded. "That means the business itself may be separate property, but any income earned during the marriage could still be subject to division." He placed the papers neatly back on the desk. "Do you have access to your joint bank accounts?" "Yes." "Good." Daniel picked up a pen and wrote several notes. From this point forward, documentation becomes extremely important. Isabel's expression remained calm. "I understand," Daniel continued. "Do not confront your husband about the hidden account yet. I won't. If he believes you're unaware, he may continue making financial decisions that reveal more information." Isabel nodded. Daniel paused. "Also, he said, do not sign these divorce papers. I wasn't planning to." Daniel allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "That's good." Grace shifted slightly in the carrier. Daniel glanced at the baby briefly. "How old?" 5 days. Daniel nodded slowly. "Your husband served divorce papers less than a week after your daughter was born." "Yes." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "That's unusual timing." "Yes." Silence filled the room for a moment. Then Daniel spoke again. "There's one more thing we should discuss." "What is that forensic accounting?" Isabel waited. Daniel continued. "If your husband has moved money through business accounts or private banking institutions, a forensic accountant can trace the transactions. Can they see everything? Eventually." "Yes," Daniel said. "But it takes time and legal requests." He wrote another name on the notepad and slid it toward her. "Rachel Kim, forensic accountant." "She's one of the best in the city," Daniel said. Isabel looked at the name. "What happens next?" she asked. Daniel's tone remained steady. "Next, we respond legally." He tapped the divorce papers again. "We request full financial disclosure." And if Jeremy refuses, Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Then the court orders it." Isabel sat quietly for a moment. Through the office window, snow continued falling across the city. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Yes, my husband believes this divorce will be simple." Daniel folded his hands again. "From what I've seen so far," he said calmly, "it won't be." Isabel nodded once. For the first time since Jeremy placed the envelope on the coffee table, the situation had begun to take shape. Jeremy believed he had already planned everything. But planning required secrecy, and secrecy rarely survived careful investigation. Daniel closed the folder. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "if you're willing to proceed, we'll begin building the case." Isabel adjusted Grace's blanket gently. "I am." Daniel nodded. Then he reached for the phone. "Let's start with Rachel Kim." In Brookhaven Ridge, reputation traveled quietly but quickly. It moved through school parking lots, church foyers, neighborhood charity events, and the polite conversations that happened while parents waited for children after piano lessons or soccer practice. Jeremy Thornton understood this better than most people. For years, he had carefully built a public image of discipline, stability, and success. His firm had grown steadily, his home looked prosperous, and his family appeared orderly and respectable. Now that image needed protection. 2 weeks after Isabel met with Daniel Brooks, Jeremy began shaping the story others would hear. He did it the way experienced professionals often did, not through dramatic announcements, but through carefully placed conversations. The first occurred at his office. Thornton's strategic advisors occupied the 6th floor of a modern office building downtown. Jeremy's glass-walled office overlooked the river, giving clients the impression of confidence and progress. That afternoon, Jeremy's business partner, Nathan Cole, stopped by with a folder of quarterly reports. Nathan had known Jeremy for nearly 8 years. Their partnership worked because Nathan focused on operations while Jeremy managed client relationships. Nathan closed the office door behind him. "Everything all right at home?" he asked casually. Jeremy sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Not really." Nathan waited. Jeremy had already decided what version of the story Nathan would hear. "Isabel's struggling," Jeremy said quietly. Nathan frowned slightly. "With the new baby?" Jeremy nodded. "5 kids is a lot." Nathan didn't argue. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I imagine it is." Jeremy rubbed his forehead as though exhausted. "She's been overwhelmed for a while now." Nathan shifted his weight. "What are you going to do?" Jeremy looked out the window briefly. "I think we're heading toward divorce." Nathan's eyebrows lifted. "That's serious?" Jeremy nodded. "I've tried to be patient," he said, "but she's just not managing well anymore." Nathan studied him carefully. Jeremy's tone sounded reasonable, controlled, almost reluctant. "You sure that's the right move?" Nathan asked. Jeremy exhaled slowly. "Sometimes you have to do what's best for the kids." The phrase hung in the air with the quiet authority of something that sounded responsible. Nathan nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I guess so." Jeremy allowed the conversation to end there. He knew better than to oversell a story. If he appeared calm and reluctant, others would fill in the emotional gaps themselves. Later that week, a similar conversation happened at church. Margaret Thornton stood near the refreshment table after the Sunday service, speaking with 2 women from the church charity board. Margaret's tone carried the gentle sadness of someone sharing difficult news. "Jeremy and Isabel have been under a lot of strain," she said softly. One of the women frowned with concern. "5 children is certainly a handful." Margaret nodded, "especially for Isabel." The other woman asked carefully, "Is she all right?" Margaret sighed quietly. "She's always been sensitive." The sentence sounded compassionate, but it planted an idea. Margaret continued, "Jeremy has tried to support her, but sometimes people simply aren't prepared for the responsibilities they take on." The women nodded sympathetically. No accusations had been spoken. No harsh words had been used. But the implication traveled smoothly through the conversation. By the time church ended that morning, several people had already begun whispering gentle concern about Isabel Thornton. Meanwhile, Isabel spent her days quietly building structure inside the house. Emma helped with the younger girls after school. Sophie had developed a habit of asking questions about the baby's tiny hands. Lucy insisted Grace smiled at her. Charlotte tried to carry the diaper bag everywhere. Isabel moved through the routine with calm precision. Breakfast, school schedules, laundry, doctor appointments. But in the evenings after the girls slept, she continued organizing information for Daniel Brooks. Bank statements, emails, receipts, anything that might connect Jeremy's finances to the Northbridge account. Rachel Kim had already begun analyzing the documents Daniel provided. Rachel worked from a quiet office several blocks away, where spreadsheets and transaction records covered her desk. Forensic accounting required patience. Money left trails, but those trails often hid beneath layers of transfers and business transactions. Rachel reviewed the Northbridge account opening again. Then she examined the transfer Isabel had discovered. The funds had originated from Thornton's strategic advisors, but before arriving at Northbridge, they had passed through 2 intermediary accounts. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Interesting," she murmured. The pattern suggested deliberate structuring, not illegal by itself, but suspicious in the context of a divorce filing. She made several notes and emailed Daniel. Meanwhile, Jeremy continued shaping his version of the story. One afternoon, he visited the school where Emma and Sophie studied. He waited near the pickup line where several parents gathered in small groups. When Emma emerged with her backpack, Jeremy greeted her warmly. But one of the mothers nearby had overheard his earlier conversation with another parent. "I heard things have been difficult at home," she said gently. Jeremy hesitated just long enough to seem reluctant. "It's been challenging," he admitted. The mother nodded sympathetically. "I can't imagine 5 children at once." Jeremy forced a tired smile. Neither can Isabel, apparently. The comment sounded almost like a joke, but the idea settled easily into the conversation. By the time Emma climbed into the car, 2 parents had already exchanged concerned glances. Inside the house that evening, Isabel noticed something subtle. Emma seemed quieter than usual. While clearing the dinner plates, Emma finally spoke. "Mom." Yes, Emma hesitated. "Some parents at school were talking today." Isabel waited. "They said, you and Dad might get divorced." Isabel dried her hands slowly. Children often heard things before adults realized they were listening. "What did you say?" Isabel asked gently. Emma shrugged. "I didn't say anything." Isabel nodded. "That was wise." Emma looked uncertain. "Is it true?" Isabel met her daughter's eyes calmly. "Your father and I are working through some decisions." Emma studied her for a moment. Then she nodded. "Okay." She didn't ask more questions. Emma had already learned something important from watching her mother. Sometimes silence meant strength. That night, after the girls went to bed, Isabel opened her notebook again. A new entry appeared, February 2nd. Emma heard discussion at school about divorce. She paused. Then she added another line, Jeremy speaking publicly about situation. The notebook closed quietly. Isabel did not try to stop Jeremy's story from spreading. Arguments rarely corrected rumors. Evidence did. And somewhere in a downtown office, Rachel Kim was already uncovering the financial patterns Jeremy Thornton believed no one would notice. Rachel Kim believed numbers spoke more honestly than most people. Her office was small, functional, and quiet. Just 2 desks, 3 computer monitors, and shelves filled with binders from past investigations. The window overlooked a narrow alley behind the building, where delivery trucks rumbled through the snow and left dark tire marks on the pavement. Rachel preferred working there. Distractions were minimal, and forensic accounting required concentration. On her screen, the financial records connected to Jeremy Thornton's business accounts filled several spreadsheets, columns of dates, transfer amounts, bank routing numbers. At first glance, the transactions looked ordinary. Thornton's strategic advisors handled client funds regularly, and large transfers were part of the firm's daily activity. But Rachel was not studying the large transfers. She was studying the small ones, the patterns. 3 transfers in October, 2 more in November, all routed through intermediary accounts before arriving at Northbridge Private Bank. Rachel leaned forward, scrolling carefully through the entries. Each transfer appeared disguised as a business expense reimbursement. Consulting fees, operational costs, client reimbursements. But the timing created a pattern. The money moved shortly after several of Jeremy's meetings with his attorney. Rachel clicked open another file. The account records Isabel had discovered earlier. The Northbridge account had been opened October 8th. The first transfer occurred October 12th. The second came a week later, then 2 more in November. By the time Jeremy's divorce documents were prepared on December 3rd, nearly $180,000 had passed quietly into the private account. Rachel folded her arms. "That's not an accident," she murmured. She opened a new document and began writing a preliminary report. Meanwhile, across the city, Jeremy sat in his office, reviewing client proposals. The river outside his window was half-frozen gray ice, stretching across the surface, while small boats remained docked for winter. Nathan Cole knocked once and stepped inside. "You've got a minute." Jeremy looked up. "Sure." Nathan closed the door behind him. "I just got off the phone with one of our clients," he said. "They mentioned something strange." Jeremy's attention sharpened slightly. "What kind of strange?" Nathan sat down in the chair across from the desk. "They said the bank flagged a few transfers last quarter." Jeremy kept his expression neutral. "Which transfers?" Nathan slid a printed report across the desk. Jeremy recognized the account numbers immediately, but his face did not show it. "These look like reimbursements," Jeremy said calmly. "That's what the paperwork says," Nathan replied. Jeremy leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's exactly what they are." Nathan studied him for a moment. Nathan trusted Jeremy, but financial firms survived on careful documentation. "Just make sure the records line up," Nathan said. "They will." Nathan nodded once and stood. "All right." He left the office. Jeremy remained still for several seconds. Then he opened his laptop and reviewed the transfer log. Everything looked correct. The funds had passed through intermediary accounts exactly as planned. Even if someone examined Thornton's strategic advisor's records, the transactions appeared legitimate. Jeremy closed the laptop again. From his perspective, the situation remained under control. He did not know Rachel Kim existed. Back in her office, Rachel continued tracing the money. She followed the intermediary accounts first. 2 belonged to financial clearing services. The third account belonged to something more interesting, a private holding account registered under a corporate shell. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Corporate shells were not illegal, but they were often used to move funds quietly. She checked the registration details. The shell company had been created only 3 months earlier. Rachel wrote the name in her report. Then she picked up the phone and called Daniel Brooks. Daniel answered on the second ring. "Brooks. Daniel. It's Rachel. What did you find?" Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Your client's husband moved money." Daniel's voice remained calm. "How much?" "About 180,000 so far." There was a short silence, and the timing, October through November. Daniel understood immediately. Before the divorce filing. Exactly. Daniel walked toward the window of his office. "That suggests preparation." Rachel continued. He routed the money through 2 clearing accounts and 1 shell company before transferring it to Northbridge. Daniel nodded slowly. "Can you document the full trail? I'm already doing it." Daniel paused. "Do you think the court will see this as concealment?" Rachel's answer was precise. "If the funds originated from marital income and he didn't disclose them, yes." Daniel smiled faintly. Jeremy Thornton thought he was clever. Rachel laughed quietly. "Most people who hide money think that." Meanwhile, Isabel sat at the kitchen table, helping Charlotte with a drawing assignment. Charlotte held up a crayon sketch proudly. "Look, Mom." The drawing showed 5 stick figures holding hands. 1 taller figure stood beside them. "Who's that?" Isabel asked gently. "Dad." Charlotte colored the sky with bright blue strokes. "Grace is the tiny one." Isabel studied the drawing. Children rarely complicated their understanding of family. They simply included everyone. "Very nice," Isabel said. Charlotte beamed. Emma entered the kitchen carrying her school backpack. She glanced at the drawing. "Grace looks like a potato." Charlotte gasped. "She does not." Emma laughed. The noise filled the room briefly. For a moment, life felt normal again. But later that evening, after dinner and homework and bedtime stories, Isabel returned to the desk in her bedroom. She opened the notebook. Another entry appeared. February 6th, Rachel Kim, analyzing transfers. She paused. Then she added something new. Possible shell company involved. Isabel closed the notebook again. Downstairs, the house remained quiet. Jeremy had not returned home yet. He had been staying late at the office more often. From Jeremy's perspective, the divorce would proceed quickly. Isabel would sign the papers eventually. The finances were already secured. The narrative was spreading through the community. Everything appeared stable, but in a quiet forensic accounting office downtown, Rachel Kim continued mapping the path of Jeremy Thornton's hidden money, and every line she traced made the picture clearer. Jeremy had moved the funds deliberately. He had moved them early, and he had never told the court. Jeremy Thornton believed privacy belonged to him. His office, located at the far end of the Thornton house's ground-floor hallway, had always been a space he treated almost like a vault. The door usually remained closed. When he worked late, the light beneath the door formed a narrow line across the wooden floor. The family knew not to interrupt. Even the girls understood. "Dad's working," Emma would whisper if one of the younger sisters wandered too close. Inside the office stood a large walnut desk, 2 monitors, and a bookshelf filled with finance textbooks and framed certificates. Jeremy kept his work files organized with the same disciplined precision he used in his professional life. But one thing he had never considered carefully was the technology sitting quietly on the corner of his desk, a small black smart speaker. Jeremy used it occasionally to control the lights in the office or ask for weather updates during early morning calls. He had also used it once to record a short voice memo during a late-night conversation, and, like many devices designed for convenience, it stored recordings automatically. Weeks earlier, one of the Thornton girls had been playing with the device, asking it simple questions about animals and planets. Isabelle had noticed the recording history feature while helping Sophie experiment with it. At the time, she had not thought much about it. Until the evening, Jeremy and Margaret spoke inside the office, while the girls were upstairs. Isabelle had been in the kitchen preparing lunches for the next school day. Their conversation had carried faintly down the hallway. The office door had been closed, but the smart speaker inside the room had still been listening. Now late on a quiet Wednesday evening, Isabelle sat alone in the office chair. Grace slept upstairs in the nursery. Jeremy was still downtown at his office. Isabelle had entered the room calmly, without hesitation. She already knew what she was looking for. The smart speaker sat exactly where Jeremy had left it. Isabelle tapped the small screen connected to the device. The menu opened. Voice history. A list of recordings appeared, each labeled by date and time. Most were harmless. "Turn lights on. What's the weather tomorrow?" "Play jazz music." Isabelle scrolled slowly. Then she saw the entry. January 12th, 8:47 p.m., 2 days before Grace was born. Isabelle tapped the recording. For a moment, there was only static. Then Margaret's voice filled the quiet office. "You've thought this through," Jeremy answered. "Yes." His voice sounded firm. "I can't keep pretending this is the family I wanted." Margaret spoke again. "And the divorce." "The paperwork is already prepared." There was a pause. Margaret sighed softly. "I hate that it's come to this." Jeremy laughed quietly. "It hasn't come to this. I planned it." Another pause. Then Margaret said something that made Isabelle's fingers tighten slightly on the edge of the desk. "What if the baby had been a boy?" Jeremy's answer came without hesitation. "Then I would have delayed it." Silence followed. Margaret spoke again. "You're certain Isabelle doesn't know about the accounts?" "No," Jeremy replied confidently. "She barely pays attention to the finances." Margaret gave a small approving hum. "Good," Jeremy continued. "Once the divorce is finalized, the money stays where it is. The court won't know it exists." Margaret chuckled softly. "You always were the careful one." The recording ended. Isabelle sat still. She did not replay the audio immediately. Instead, she wrote down the timestamp in her notebook. January 12th. Conversation Jeremy and Margaret. Then she listened again. This time she opened her laptop and began typing. Every word, every pause, every sentence. She transcribed the entire conversation. The process took nearly 20 minutes. When she finished, Isabelle saved the document and labeled the file carefully. Thornton recording. January 12th. Then she copied the file to a small flash drive and placed it inside the folder containing the other evidence. She did not smile. She did not feel satisfaction. only a quiet recognition. Jeremy had confirmed exactly what Rachel Kim's financial analysis already suggested. The divorce had been planned, the money had been hidden, and Jeremy believed Isabel was too distracted to notice. Upstairs, Grace stirred faintly in the nursery. Isabel closed the office door and went upstairs to check on her. The baby slept peacefully. Isabel stood beside the crib for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of the blanket. 5 daughters. Jeremy had described them as a mistake. But Isabel understood something. Jeremy did not. The girls were the reason she remained calm. Anger would have frightened them. Patience would protect them. The next morning, Isabel returned to Daniel Brooks's office. Snow had melted slightly overnight, leaving wet streets and patches of gray ice along the sidewalks. Daniel greeted her with the same quiet professionalism as before. When Isabel placed the flash drive on his desk, he raised an eyebrow. "What's this A recording?" Isabel said. Daniel inserted the drive into his computer. The audio played through the office speakers. He listened carefully. When Jeremy's voice said the paperwork is already prepared, Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. When the conversation ended, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Well," he said calmly, "that's helpful." Isabel waited. Daniel opened the transcript Isabel had typed. "You transcribed it already?" "Yes." Daniel read through the document again. "This establishes intent," he said. "What kind of intent?" Isabel asked. "Intent to conceal assets. Intent to mislead the court." Daniel paused. "And intent to manipulate the timing of the divorce." Isabel said nothing. Daniel looked at her. "Did your husband know the device recorded the conversation?" "I don't think so." Daniel nodded slowly. "That makes the recording even more interesting." He saved the file and printed a copy of the transcript. "This will need to be authenticated," he said. "But assuming everything checks out." He tapped the transcript with his finger. "This changes the case significantly." Isabel remained calm. Daniel studied her expression. "Most people would feel angry hearing this," he said. "I expected it," Isabel replied. Daniel nodded once. Then he leaned forward. "We'll introduce this carefully. What does that mean?" "It means your husband doesn't need to know we have it yet." Daniel placed the transcript into a legal folder. Let him continue believing he's ahead. Outside the office window, clouds drifted slowly across the pale winter sky. Daniel looked back at Isabel. "Because when the court hears this recording," he said quietly, "the story Jeremy Thornton has been telling everyone will collapse." Isabel nodded. For months she had been writing down details others overlooked. Now those details were beginning to form something larger than Jeremy had imagined. And the recording on Daniel Brooks's desk was only one piece of the truth that would soon come into the open. Legal procedures rarely moved quickly. Daniel Brooks often told his clients that the law functioned less like a storm and more like a tide, slow, deliberate, and relentless once it began to rise. 2 weeks after Isabel delivered the recording, the first formal documents were filed. Jeremy Thornton received them on a Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting in his office, reviewing client projections, when his assistant knocked lightly on the glass door. "Jeremy," he looked up. "Yes, there's a courier here for you." Jeremy frowned slightly. "Couriers usually deliver documents for clients, not personal matters. Send them in." A man stepped inside, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a sealed envelope. Jeremy Thornton. "Yes, you've been served." Jeremy's eyebrows lifted a fraction as he accepted the envelope. The courier left as quietly as he had arrived. Jeremy opened the packet. Inside were legal documents bearing the letterhead of Brooks and Halstead. He scanned the first page quickly. Then he read it again. Isabel Thornton had formally retained counsel. Jeremy leaned back slowly in his chair. For a moment he said nothing. Then he reached for his phone and dialed his attorney. "Fletcher," the voice answered. Martin Jeremy said. "We have a problem." Within the hour, Jeremy was seated inside the downtown offices of Fletcher and Dunn Family Law. Martin Fletcher was a seasoned attorney who had handled dozens of divorces involving wealthy clients. He read the documents Isabel's attorney had filed with careful attention. Jeremy watched him across the polished conference table. "Well?" Jeremy asked. Martin set the papers down. "Your wife has requested full financial discovery." Jeremy exhaled impatiently. "That's standard, isn't it?" "Yes," Martin replied calmly, "but the scope of this request is broad." Jeremy frowned. "What does that mean?" Martin slid the document across the table. "Your wife's attorney is requesting disclosure of all financial accounts, including private investment accounts, corporate holdings, intermediary transfers, and third-party financial instruments connected to Thornton Strategic Advisors." Jeremy's expression hardened slightly. "That's excessive." Martin shrugged. "Legally, it's allowed." Jeremy tapped the table with his finger. "They're fishing." Martin did not respond immediately. "Do you have anything they might find?" he asked. Jeremy's voice remained steady. "No." Martin studied him carefully. "If they've requested this level of discovery, they believe something exists." Jeremy leaned back. "They're guessing." Martin nodded slowly. "That may be true." He closed the folder. "Regardless, we'll respond appropriately." Jeremy felt a brief flicker of irritation. He had expected Isabel to sign the divorce papers quickly. Instead, she had hired a lawyer who specialized in financial cases. Still, Jeremy believed the situation remained manageable. The Northbridge account was separate. The transfers were structured. Nothing directly connected the money to the divorce filing. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks reviewed the same documents from his office. Isabel sat across from him, Grace sleeping quietly in the carrier at her feet. Daniel adjusted his glasses. "Jeremy's attorney will respond soon," he said. "With what financial disclosures?" Daniel tapped a page on the desk. "But they won't disclose everything voluntarily." Isabel already understood that. "So what happens then?" she asked. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Then we ask the court to compel full disclosure. Will the court approve that?" Daniel smiled faintly. "With the evidence we already have, I believe they will." He opened another folder. Inside were Rachel Kim's updated financial reports. Rachel had traced several additional transfers connected to Jeremy's business accounts. The numbers were growing. Daniel slid the report toward Isabel. "These transfers continue through December," he said. Isabel scanned the page quietly. After Grace was born, she noted. "Yes." Daniel folded his hands. "That strengthens our argument." "What argument?" "That Jeremy moved money while preparing for divorce and deliberately failed to disclose it." Isabel nodded. Outside the office window, traffic moved slowly through melting snow. Daniel continued. "There's another step coming soon." "What step?" "Depositions." Isabel listened carefully. Daniel explained. "Depositions allow attorneys to question parties under oath before trial. Jeremy will have to answer questions." "Yes, and if he lies," Daniel's voice remained calm, "then the evidence will contradict him." Across the city, Jeremy sat in a restaurant with Nathan Cole. They had chosen a quiet table near the back. Nathan had heard rumors circulating among several clients. "You didn't mention Isabel hired a lawyer," Nathan said. Jeremy shrugged. "It's just procedure." Nathan stirred his coffee. "I also heard something about financial discovery." Jeremy's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who told you that word travels?" Nathan replied. Jeremy leaned forward. "This has nothing to do with the firm." Nathan raised his hand slightly. "Relax. I'm not accusing you of anything." Jeremy sat back again. "Good." Nathan hesitated before speaking again. "Look if there's anything the firm needs to prepare for." "There isn't," Jeremy interrupted. Nathan studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right. but the conversation left a faint tension behind. Back at the Thornton house that evening, Isabel helped Lucy with a school project about winter animals. Lucy held up a drawing of a fox. "Do foxes live alone?" she asked. "Sometimes," Isabel replied. Lucy frowned. "Don't they get lonely?" Isabel smiled slightly. "Animals survive in different ways." Lucy nodded thoughtfully. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Isabel returned to the bedroom desk. She opened the notebook again. Another entry appeared. February 18th. Jeremy served discovery request. She paused. Then she added another line. Rachel confirmed additional transfers. The notebook closed softly. Downstairs, the house was silent again. Jeremy had not returned home yet. He had begun staying late at the office more frequently. From his perspective, the divorce had simply become more complicated than expected. From Isabel's perspective, the legal process had only just begun. And soon, Jeremy Thornton would have to answer questions under oath. Questions connected to money he believed no one could trace. For years, Jeremy Thornton had repeated the same sentence in quiet conversations with friends, relatives, and sometimes even strangers. "I guess we just never got lucky with a boy." He said it lightly, usually with a smile that suggested patience rather than frustration. But behind the sentence lived something deeper, a belief. Jeremy had always believed Isabel had somehow failed him, not intentionally, but biologically. It was an assumption so common that few people ever questioned it, except the doctors who had once spoken to Isabel privately. Nearly 7 years earlier, after Charlotte's birth, Jeremy and Isabel had briefly consulted a fertility specialist. Jeremy had not considered the appointment very important. To him, it had been a quick visit. One conversation, a few routine tests, nothing serious. But Isabel remembered every word. Now sitting in Daniel Brooks's office, months later, she placed a thin envelope on the desk. Daniel looked at it curiously. "What's this, medical records?" Isabel said. Daniel opened the envelope and removed several pages. They were copies of documents from Riverside Fertility Clinic. He skimmed the first page. Then he slowed down. "This consultation happened after your 4th daughter was born." "Yes." Daniel continued reading. The report summarized several biological facts the specialist had explained to them during that meeting. One sentence stood out clearly. "The sex of a child is determined by the father's genetic contribution." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You kept this?" Isabel nodded. "I keep most things." Daniel read the next page. The fertility specialist had explained that Isabel's reproductive health showed no abnormalities, but Jeremy had declined further testing. Daniel looked up. "Did your husband understand what the doctor told him?" "Yes." Daniel tapped the page lightly. "And he still blamed you?" Isabel did not answer immediately. "Not directly," she said after a moment. "But the implication was always there." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's common." He leaned forward. "But the biological reality is simple." Isabel waited. "The father's chromosome determines the child's sex," Daniel said. "X or Y." "Yes. And your husband never mentioned that when explaining the divorce." "Number." Daniel smiled faintly. "I didn't think so." He placed the documents beside the other evidence in the case file. "This isn't necessarily central to the legal case," he said, "but it helps explain the narrative he's been presenting." Isabel understood. Jeremy had built his public story around a quiet accusation. Isabel had failed to give him a son. But the truth was different, and the truth had been written down long before the divorce began. Meanwhile, Jeremy sat across from Martin Fletcher in a private conference room. They were preparing for the upcoming deposition. Martin placed several documents on the table. "Your wife's attorney will ask detailed questions about your finances," he said. Jeremy nodded. "I expected that." Martin pointed to a section of the report. They've requested explanations for several transfers connected to Thornton's strategic advisors. Jeremy folded his arms. They were business reimbursements. Martin looked directly at him. You're certain about that? Yes. Martin tapped his pen against the folder. Jeremy. I need absolute honesty. Jeremy's voice remained steady. There's nothing illegal. Martin nodded slowly. That's not exactly what I asked. Jeremy leaned forward slightly. The transfers were legitimate. Martin studied him carefully. If the opposing attorney produces evidence that contradicts that claim, he said your credibility could suffer. Jeremy exhaled. They won't. Martin closed the folder. Then we proceed. Jeremy stood. The deposition would happen the following week. From his perspective, it was simply another procedural step. He still believed Isabel's case, relied mostly on suspicion. Back at the Thornton house, Isabel sat at the kitchen table with Emma. Emma was working through algebra homework while Isabel reviewed several printed bank statements. Emma glanced up. Mom, yes, are you and Dad fighting? Isabel paused. Children often sensed tension long before adults explained it. Your father and I see things differently right now, she said calmly. Emma studied her mother carefully. Are you okay? Isabel reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand gently. Yes. Emma nodded slowly. She trusted that answer. Years of watching her mother had taught her something important. Isabel rarely spoke dramatically. When she said she was okay, she meant it. Emma returned to her homework. Isabel returned to the bank statements. Later that evening, Rachel Kim visited Daniel's office again. She carried a thick binder. I finished tracing the transfers, she said. Daniel opened the binder. Charts filled the pages. Lines connecting accounts. Dates, amounts. Rachel pointed to the first page. This shows the movement of funds from Thornton's strategic advisors into the intermediary accounts. Daniel nodded. And here, Rachel flipped the page. This shows the transfer to the Northbridge account. Daniel studied the timeline. The pattern was clear. Money moved in stages, first through legitimate business accounts, then through clearing services, finally into the private investment account Jeremy had never disclosed. Daniel looked up. Could this be explained as normal business activity? Rachel shook her head. Not convincingly. Why Rachel pointed to the final page. Because the money never came back. Daniel smiled slightly. Jeremy had treated the divorce as a simple business transaction. But the financial trail now stretched across dozens of pages. Daniel closed the binder. This will be useful during the deposition. Rachel nodded. He'll have to explain every transfer. Daniel looked thoughtful. And if he lies? Rachel shrugged. Then the documents will speak. Later that night, Isabel added another entry to her notebook. February 25th. Medical records provided to Daniel. She paused. Then she wrote one more line. Truth about child gender determined by father. The sentence looked simple on the page, but it represented something Jeremy had ignored for years. Isabel closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. Down the hallway, her daughters slept peacefully. 5 girls. Jeremy had treated their existence as evidence of failure, but Isabel had never believed they were a mistake. And soon, inside a quiet conference room under oath, Jeremy Thornton would be asked to explain the decisions he had made while preparing to leave them. The deposition took place on a gray Monday morning. The conference room at Fletcher & Dunn was quiet and carefully arranged long-polished table pitchers of water, neatly stacked legal folders placed in front of each chair. Large windows overlooked the downtown streets where traffic moved slowly beneath low winter clouds. Depositions were not theatrical. There were no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, just questions, answers, and a court reporter quietly typing every word that was spoken. Jeremy Thornton arrived 10 minutes early. He wore the same navy suit he often chose for important client meetings. His expression was calm, composed, the expression of someone accustomed to professional scrutiny. Martin Fletcher sat beside him, reviewing the deposition outline. "Remember," Martin said quietly, "answer only the question asked." Jeremy nodded. "I know the process." Across the table, Daniel Brooks entered the room carrying a slim leather briefcase. Isabel followed him. She sat quietly beside her attorney, hands folded in her lap. Grace remained at home with Emma that morning. Daniel had advised that Isabel did not need to bring the baby. The court reporter adjusted her equipment. "Let's begin," Daniel said calmly. Jeremy leaned slightly forward in his chair. Daniel opened a folder. "Mr. Thornton, for the record, please state your full name." "Jeremy Michael Thornton. And your occupation, founder and managing partner of Thornton Strategic Advisors." Daniel nodded. "Mr. Thornton, you filed for divorce from Isabel Thornton shortly after the birth of your 5th child, correct?" Jeremy's voice remained steady. "Yes. What was the reason for the divorce?" Jeremy glanced briefly toward Isabel. "Our marriage had become unsustainable." "In what way?" Jeremy cleared his throat. There were increasing tensions in the household. Daniel waited. "Could you elaborate?" he asked. Jeremy chose his words carefully. "The demands of raising 5 children created strain." Daniel wrote a note. "Specifically daughters, correct?" Jeremy hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes." Daniel looked up. "You had hoped for a son." Jeremy's jaw tightened slightly. "I think many fathers hope for that." Daniel nodded calmly. "Did your disappointment influence your decision to divorce your wife?" Jeremy shook his head. "No." Daniel made another note. "Let's discuss the timing of your divorce filing." Jeremy shifted slightly in his chair. Daniel slid a document across the table. "Your divorce papers were prepared December 3rd, correct?" Jeremy glanced at the document. "Yes." Daniel turned another page. "And your daughter Grace was born January 14th. "Yes." Daniel looked directly at him. "So the divorce documents were prepared 6 weeks before the child was born." Jeremy's voice remained firm. "Yes." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Why prepare divorce documents?" "Before the birth," Jeremy answered smoothly. "I wanted to be prepared for all outcomes." Daniel nodded slowly. "What outcomes?" Jeremy's answer came quickly. "If the situation in the household remained unstable." Daniel wrote something down. Then he opened another folder. "Mr. Thornton, I'd like to discuss your financial disclosures." Jeremy straightened slightly. "Of course." Daniel slid a sheet across the table. "Do you recognize this document?" Jeremy looked at it. "Yes." "It's my financial disclosure statement." Daniel nodded. "In this statement, you list several bank accounts and investment holdings." "That's correct." Daniel tapped the page lightly. "However, you do not list an account with Northbridge Private Bank." Jeremy felt the first faint shift in the room's atmosphere. "I don't recall such an account," he said carefully. Daniel did not react. Instead, he placed another document on the table. "The Northbridge account confirmation." Jeremy recognized it immediately. But he kept his expression neutral. Daniel asked calmly, "Is this your account, Mr. Thornton?" Jeremy paused. Then he nodded. "Yes. Why was it not disclosed in your financial statement?" Jeremy glanced at Martin Fletcher. Martin leaned forward slightly. "Answer if you know," he said quietly. Jeremy chose his words carefully. It was a temporary business account. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "For what purpose?" "Short-term investment management." Daniel opened another folder. "I see." He placed Rachel Kim's financial chart on the table. "This document traces several transfers from Thornton Strategic Advisors into that account." Jeremy examined the page briefly. "Yes." Daniel spoke calmly. The total amount transferred appears to be approximately $180,000. Jeremy nodded. That sounds correct. Daniel leaned forward slightly. When did these transfers begin? Jeremy hesitated. I don't remember the exact dates. Daniel turned another page. The first transfer occurred October 12th. Jeremy said nothing. Daniel continued. The second occurred October 19th. Another pause. Daniel looked directly at him. Were you already considering divorce? At that time, Jeremy's voice remained controlled. No. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he slid one final document across the table. It was the transcript Isabel had prepared from the smart speaker recording. Jeremy's eyes moved across the page. For the first time since the deposition began, his composure faltered slightly. Daniel spoke quietly. Mr. Thornton, this transcript reflects a conversation between you and Margaret Thornton on January 12th. Jeremy remained silent. Daniel continued. In that conversation, you state that the divorce paperwork was already prepared. Jeremy looked at Martin. Martin's expression remained unreadable. Daniel continued calmly. You also state that your wife barely pays attention to finances, and that the court won't know about certain accounts. The room became very still. Jeremy spoke slowly. I don't recall that conversation. Daniel nodded. That's understandable. He opened his briefcase. Inside was a small speaker. Daniel pressed a button. Jeremy's own voice filled the room. I planned it. Margaret's voice followed. You're certain Isabel doesn't know about the accounts? Jeremy's voice again. She barely pays attention to the finances. The recording ended. No one spoke for several seconds. Jeremy's face had gone pale. Martin Fletcher removed his glasses slowly. Daniel folded his hands. Mr. Thornton, he said calmly, would you like to revise your previous answers? Jeremy stared at the table. For years he had believed Isabel's silence meant ignorance. But now, sitting in the quiet deposition room, he understood something too late. She had been listening all along. The deposition room remained silent long after the recording ended. Jeremy Thornton stared at the transcript on the table in front of him, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper. The calm confidence he had carried into the room that morning had shifted into something tighter, more fragile. Across the table, Daniel Brooks closed the small speaker and returned it to his briefcase. No one rushed the moment. The court reporter continued typing quietly, recording every second of the silence. Martin Fletcher cleared his throat. Jeremy, he said carefully, answer the question. Jeremy finally lifted his eyes. Daniel repeated calmly, would you like to revise your earlier statement regarding the Northbridge account and your knowledge of it during the divorce filing? Jeremy exhaled slowly. Yes, he said. Daniel nodded once. Please explain. Jeremy leaned back slightly in his chair, his mind moving quickly through the narrowing options available to him. I opened the Northbridge account as a personal investment account, he said. I intended to disclose it later. Daniel did not react. And the transfers from Thornton's strategic advisors, they were temporary allocations. Daniel picked up another document. Temporary, he repeated. He slid the page across the table. Rachel Kim's financial chart spread across the polished surface. This analysis shows the funds were transferred through intermediary clearing accounts and a corporate shell before reaching Northbridge. Jeremy glanced down at the page but said nothing. Daniel continued. Can you explain the purpose of those intermediary transfers? Jeremy hesitated. They were part of routine financial structuring. Daniel's voice remained calm. And the Shell Corporation. Jeremy looked up. That was an investment vehicle. Daniel tapped the chart again. Is it standard practice for your firm to move personal funds through business reimbursement channels before transferring them to Private investment accounts. Martin Fletcher spoke quietly. Jeremy answered carefully. Jeremy nodded. It happens occasionally. Daniel leaned back. The room remained quiet again. But this time the silence felt heavier. Daniel reached into his briefcase and removed a thick binder. He opened it slowly. Inside were printed copies of Rachel Kim's forensic accounting report. Daniel placed the binder on the table and turned it toward Jeremy. This report contains a detailed timeline of every transfer connected to the Northbridge account. Jeremy's eyes moved across the pages. Dates, amounts, routing paths. Daniel continued. It also shows that the funds originated from Thornton's strategic advisors during the same period you were consulting with your divorce attorney. Jeremy did not respond. Daniel spoke again. Would you like to explain why marital income was moved through concealed channels shortly before your divorce filing? Jeremy's jaw tightened. I disagree with the word concealed. Daniel nodded. What word would you prefer? Jeremy hesitated. Strategic. Daniel's expression did not change. Strategic. He made a note. Then he turned another page in the binder. This section identifies additional transfers made after the birth of your daughter, Grace. Jeremy looked up sharply. After the birth. Yes. Daniel slid the page toward him. January 20th. January 26th. Jeremy studied the numbers. He had assumed the later transfers were small enough to avoid attention. Rachel Kim had traced them anyway. Daniel spoke quietly. These funds were not disclosed in your financial statement. Jeremy's voice remained steady but quieter now. They were not finalized investments yet. Daniel closed the binder. I see. He glanced briefly toward Isabelle. She had remained silent throughout the deposition. Her posture was calm, her expression unchanged. The quiet woman Jeremy had dismissed for years now sat beside the attorney who had dismantled his financial narrative piece by piece. Daniel turned back toward Jeremy. Let's review the timeline again. He spoke slowly. October. Northbridge account opened. October through November. Multiple transfers routed through intermediary accounts. December 3rd. Divorce documents prepared. January 12th. Recorded conversation, acknowledging the account and divorce preparation. Daniel paused. January 14th. Your daughter Grace is born. Another pause. January 20th and 26th. Additional transfers. Jeremy said nothing. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Mr. Thornton, does this timeline appear accurate? Jeremy nodded reluctantly. Yes. Daniel folded his hands. Then we returned to the original question. He spoke quietly. Why were these assets not disclosed? Jeremy's answer came after a long pause. I intended to disclose them later. Daniel allowed the silence to linger again. Then he asked one final question. After the divorce was finalized, Jeremy did not respond. Martin Fletcher placed a hand lightly on the table. I believe we should take a short recess, he said. Daniel nodded. That would be reasonable. The court reporter stopped typing. Jeremy stood slowly and stepped out into the hallway. The conference room door closed behind him. In the hallway, Jeremy leaned against the wall briefly. His mind raced. He had underestimated Isabelle. For years he had believed her quiet nature meant passivity. Instead, she had been collecting information, observing, recording. Inside the conference room, Daniel turned toward Isabelle. You handled that well, he said quietly. Isabelle nodded once. I only listened. Daniel smiled faintly. That's usually enough. He glanced at the binder on the table. Rachel's analysis was the turning point. Isabelle understood. Numbers did not argue. They simply existed. Across the hallway, Jeremy returned after several minutes. His expression had regained some composure. The deposition resumed. Daniel asked a few final questions about Thornton's strategic advisors and Jeremy's role in managing company funds. Jeremy answered carefully now, every sentence measured, every word deliberate. But the earlier confidence was gone. When the deposition finally ended, the court reporter gathered her equipment. Jeremy closed his folder and stood. For a moment, he looked across the table at Isabel. She met his gaze calmly. No anger, no triumph, just quiet certainty. Jeremy looked away, first. Outside the office building, the late afternoon sky had begun to darken. Traffic lights glowed against wet pavement as cars moved slowly through the streets. The deposition had lasted nearly 4 hours, but its effect would last far longer. Because the documents presented that day had done something Jeremy Thornton had never expected. They had turned his carefully planned divorce into a documented pattern of concealment. And the court would soon review every page. Courtrooms rarely delivered justice with dramatic speeches or sudden revelations. Instead, they operated through order documentation and patience. 3 months after the deposition, the Thornton divorce case reached its most important hearing. The courtroom inside the Hennepin County Family Court building was modest rows of wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, and 2 tables where attorneys organized their files carefully before proceedings began. Isabelle sat beside Daniel Brooks, her posture calm, hands folded neatly in her lap. Jeremy sat across the aisle with Martin Fletcher. Neither of them spoke. Outside the courtroom windows, early spring sunlight touched the tops of the nearby buildings. Snow had finally melted from the city streets. The clerk called the case, Thornton versus Thornton. Everyone stood as Judge Helen Caldwell entered the room. She was known for her patience and precision in financial cases. Once seated, she glanced briefly through the documents already placed before her. "Counsel," she said, "we are here to review financial disclosures and asset division related to the Thornton divorce." Daniel Brooks rose first. "Your Honor, we will present evidence demonstrating that Mr. Thornton failed to disclose significant marital assets and intentionally moved funds prior to filing for divorce." Judge Caldwell nodded. "Proceed." Daniel approached the table and placed a binder before the judge. This report was prepared by forensic accountant Rachel Kim. Rachel sat quietly behind him, ready to answer questions if needed. Daniel opened the binder. "Your Honor, this document traces approximately $180,000 transferred from Thornton's strategic advisors through intermediary accounts into a private Northbridge investment account." The judge examined the chart. "When did these transfers occur?" she asked. "Between October and late January," Daniel replied. "And when were the divorce documents prepared?" "December 3rd. The judge looked up. "So the transfers occurred both before and after the filing?" "Yes, Your Honor." Martin Fletcher stood. "Your Honor, the funds in question were business-related investments and not concealed assets." Judge Caldwell turned toward him. "Then why were they not listed in the financial disclosure statement?" Martin hesitated slightly. They had not yet been finalized. Daniel spoke calmly. "Your Honor, the funds remained under Mr. Thornton's control and originated from marital income." Judge Caldwell nodded thoughtfully. "Continue." Daniel pressed a button on the small speaker placed beside the binder. The courtroom filled with Jeremy's recorded voice. "I planned it." Margaret's voice followed. "You're certain Isabel doesn't know about the accounts?" Jeremy's answer echoed through the room. "She barely pays attention to the finances." The recording ended. Silence settled across the courtroom. Judge Caldwell leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Fletcher," she said calmly, "does your client dispute the authenticity of that recording?" Martin Fletcher glanced toward Jeremy. Jeremy shook his head slightly. "No, Your Honor." Martin replied. The judge folded her hands. "Then it appears Mr. Thornton intentionally withheld financial information during the divorce process." Jeremy shifted in his seat. Daniel spoke again. Your Honor, we also submit medical documentation relevant to the narrative Mr. Thornton has presented publicly regarding the cause of the divorce. Judge Caldwell examined the additional file. Daniel continued. The records confirm that the biological determination of a child's sex is controlled by paternal genetic contribution. Jeremy looked sharply toward Daniel, but Daniel's tone remained neutral. This fact contradicts Mr. Thornton's repeated claim that his wife failed to provide him with a male heir. The judge closed the file. While the biological matter is not central to financial division, she said it does provide context regarding motive. The hearing continued for another hour. Rachel Kim explained the financial charts. Martin Fletcher attempted to frame the transfers as routine investment strategies, but the timeline remained clear. Transfers, hidden account, prepared divorce documents, recorded admission. Finally, Judge Caldwell spoke. Her voice remained calm and measured. Mr. Thornton, the court finds that you failed to disclose marital assets and attempted to shield those assets during divorce proceedings. Jeremy stared straight ahead. The court will therefore reallocate the undisclosed funds in favor of Mrs. Thornton, she continued. In addition, the court orders full transparency regarding all financial holdings connected to Thornton's strategic advisors during the marriage. Jeremy's shoulders stiffened. Judge Caldwell turned toward Isabel. Mrs. Thornton, the court also recognizes your role as the primary caregiver for 5 minor children. Isabelle remained still. Custody arrangements will reflect that reality. Daniel nodded quietly. Jeremy said nothing. There was no dramatic collapse, no raised voices, just the quiet unraveling of a strategy that had taken months to build. When the hearing ended, the courtroom slowly emptied. Jeremy remained seated for several seconds. Martin Fletcher gathered his papers silently. Across the aisle, Daniel packed the binder into his briefcase. Isabel stood. She did not look toward Jeremy. Outside the courthouse, the spring air felt warmer than it had in months. Cars passed slowly along the street. People walked along the sidewalks without noticing the quiet conclusion of the Thornton case. Daniel paused beside Isabel. You handled everything with remarkable patience, he said. Isabel nodded. I simply waited. Daniel smiled faintly. That was enough. Across the street, Jeremy stepped out of the courthouse moments later. He paused at the top of the steps. For the first time since the divorce began, the certainty he had carried with him for years felt gone. The story he had told about Isabel had collapsed, and the court had believed the documents instead. Meanwhile, Isabel walked calmly toward the parking lot. 5 daughters were waiting for her at home, and for the first time in months, the future felt quiet again. The Thornton house looked different in the early morning light, not because the walls had changed or the furniture had moved, but because the future inside it had quietly shifted. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting long, pale reflections across the wooden floor. Outside, the trees along the cul-de-sac had begun showing the first small hints of spring leaves. Isabel stood at the kitchen counter, pouring orange juice into 5 small glasses. Emma entered first, tying her hair into a loose ponytail. "Morning, Mom. Good morning." Emma glanced toward the cardboard boxes stacked neatly near the dining room wall. "Are we finishing the packing today?" "Yes." Emma nodded and began helping set out breakfast plates. Sophie followed a minute later, carrying Lucy's backpack. Lucy and Charlotte arrived, arguing softly about whose turn it was to feed the neighbor's dog later that afternoon. Grace slept peacefully in a baby seat near the table, her tiny hands curled into the soft blanket. The house was busy, but the tension that had lived there for months had faded. 3 days earlier, the court had finalized the primary terms of the Thornton divorce. Jeremy would remain responsible for financial support. The undisclosed funds had been reassigned to Isabel's share of the marital assets, and custody arrangements recognized Isabel as the central parent in the girls' daily lives. None of it had happened loudly. There had been no celebration, just paperwork, decisions, signatures. Now the next step was simpler: leaving. Isabel had already arranged a smaller home 10 minutes away near the girls' school. It had 4 bedrooms instead of 5, but it had a large backyard and a quiet neighborhood park nearby. More importantly, it felt peaceful. Emma placed a bowl of cereal in front of Charlotte. "Eat before it gets soggy," she said. Charlotte frowned at the cereal suspiciously. It already looked soggy. Lucy laughed. Isabel watched them with quiet affection. 5 daughters. Jeremy had once described them as a burden, but Isabel had never seen them that way. Each one carried a different strength: Emma's responsibility, Sophie's curiosity, Lucy's kindness, Charlotte's fearless energy, Grace's quiet beginning. After breakfast, the girls helped carry smaller boxes toward the front door: books, clothes, toys. Emma lifted a box of school supplies. "Careful," Isabel said gently. "I've got it," Emma replied. A moving truck would arrive later that afternoon, but most of the small items had already been organized. Isabel had spent the past week labeling everything carefully: kitchen, bedroom, books, baby supplies. The same calm organization she had used to document Jeremy's actions now guided the final steps of leaving the house. Around mid-morning, a car pulled slowly into the driveway. Emma glanced through the window. "Dad's here." The room grew quiet. Jeremy stepped out of the car and approached the front door. He knocked once. Isabel opened the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jeremy looked around the living room. The stacked boxes, the empty shelves. "You're moving today," he said. "Yes." Jeremy nodded. "I came to pick up some files from my office." "Of course." Isabel stepped aside. Jeremy walked through the house toward the office at the end of the hallway. The same office where he had once believed his plans were invisible. Now the room looked almost empty. Most of the furniture remained, but the shelves were cleared. Jeremy gathered several folders from the desk. When he returned to the living room, the girls stood near the staircase, watching quietly. Charlotte waved hesitantly. Jeremy forced a small smile. "Hi, Charlotte." Emma stood slightly in front of her younger sisters, protective as always. Jeremy looked at Isabel again. "You'll be close to the school?" he asked. "Yes." Jeremy nodded. "Good." The conversation felt strangely formal, not hostile, just distant. Jeremy glanced once more at the boxes. "You planned this quickly," Isabel answered calmly. "I've been planning for a while." Jeremy understood the meaning behind the sentence. He had spent months believing Isabel was unaware of his actions. In reality, she had been preparing, quietly, carefully, just as she was doing now. Jeremy looked down at the folder in his hands. "I never expected things to unfold like this," he said. Isabel did not respond immediately. Finally, she said, "Neither did I." Jeremy nodded once. Then he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused briefly. The girls watched him silently. Jeremy looked at them. 5 daughters. For a moment, his expression shifted, something uncertain, something almost reflective. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. The car engine started a few seconds later. The vehicle disappeared down the quiet street. Inside the house, the girls returned to their packing. Charlotte lifted a stuffed animal and placed it inside a box. "Grace gets the top bunk in the new house someday," she announced confidently. Lucy laughed. "She's a baby." Charlotte shrugged. "Someday." Emma carried another box toward the door. Isabel followed her outside. The air felt warm compared to the long winter months. Birds moved between the trees along the street. Emma placed the box beside the others. Then she looked at her mother. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked quietly. Isabel placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. Yes. Emma studied her face carefully. She had asked the same question weeks earlier. The answer had been the same. But now, something felt different. More certain. Emma nodded. Okay. A moving truck turned slowly into the cul-de-sac and stopped near the driveway. The driver stepped out and began lowering the ramp. Isabel watched as the girls carried the last small boxes toward the truck. No anger, no revenge, just movement, forward. Because Isabel Thornton had never needed to shout in order to change the course of her life. She had simply written things down, waited, and walked away when the time came. In stories like this, justice rarely arrives with applause. Most of the time it arrives quietly, through patience, through truth carefully preserved, and through the steady strength of someone who refuses to become bitter. Isabel Thornton never tried to defeat Jeremy in arguments. She didn't expose him publicly. She didn't humiliate him in front of the world. She simply paid attention. She wrote things down. She protected her daughters. And when the moment came, the truth spoke for itself. Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that happen in silence. A mother packing boxes. 5 daughters learning that dignity is stronger than anger. A woman walking away, not because she was pushed out, but because she chose a better path forward. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where in the world are you watching from today? And what time is it where you are right now? Feel free to share your city in the comments. And if stories about quiet strength, justice, and resilience mean something to you, you're always welcome to follow the channel so you won't miss the next one. Some stories don't shout. They simply remind us that truth has a way of being heard in the end.